In September 1944, General George Patton's Third Army had just finished one of the fastest, most spectacular advances in the history of American arms, sweeping across France so quickly that it outran its own supply lines, covering in weeks what military planners had expected to take months. Then it reached a French city called Metz and stopped. Not for days, not for weeks, for nearly 3 months, against a ring of fortifications that had last fallen to direct assault when Attila the Hun's army took the city 1,500 years earlier. This is the story of the Battle of Metz, the campaign that turned America's fastest, most celebrated general into a case study in exactly how badly a modern mechanized army could get bogged down against fortifications built for an entirely different century of warfare. By late August 1944, Patton's Third Army had chased the retreating German military across most of France, moving so quickly that it reached the Moselle River near Metz, well ahead of schedule and well ahead of the fuel and ammunition needed to keep the advance going. With no deep-water port yet open to Allied shipping and supply trucks still running the entire distance back to the original Normandy beaches, a logistics bottleneck that would take Allied planners months to fully resolve, Patton's spectacular momentum simply ran out of gas, almost literally, right at the doorstep of one of the most heavily fortified cities in Europe. Metz had been fortified in stages since the 1870s. First under German control after the Franco-Prussian War, then reinforced further during the First World War, eventually growing into a network of dozens of interlinked forts, ranging from older stone and earth positions to modern steel-reinforced concrete complexes with underground tunnel systems running for miles beneath the surrounding hills. What began in the 1870s as fairly conventional polygonal forts grew, by the early 20th century, into something considerably more sophisticated. Concrete casemates, armored gun turrets, and underground galleries connecting individual strongpoints so that defenders could move between positions without ever stepping into the open, sheltered from exactly the kind of aerial and artillery bombardment the Americans would eventually throw at them. France regained the region and its fortifications after the First World War, and, distracted by the construction of the much larger Maginot Line further south, largely let the Metz forts fall into disrepair rather than continuing to modernize them. It was only the German reoccupation of the region in 1940 and the arrival of an American army bearing down on it 4 years later that gave these aging fortifications one final, unexpected chance to prove exactly how much punishment they could still absorb. Adolf Hitler had personally designated Metz a fortress city in the spring of 1944, ordering its garrison commanders to hold their positions to the last man and surrender only with his direct personal approval he had no intention of ever giving, regardless of the actual military situation on the ground. American planners badly underestimated what they were about to run into. The forts ringing Metz had been left to decay for decades under French control before the war, and early assessments assumed a fortified position built decades earlier would pose little serious obstacle to a modern army equipped with tanks, artillery, and air support that hadn't existed when most of these fortifications were originally designed. Fort Driant, a particularly formidable position southwest of the city, built at the turn of the century and reinforced repeatedly since by both French and German military engineers, quickly proved that assumption wrong. On September 15, 1944, American fighter bombers of the 9th Air Force dropped 1,000-pound bombs directly onto the fort, scoring multiple confirmed hits on positions clearly visible from the air. The fort's defenders barely noticed. Heavy artillery, including guns as large as 240 millimeters, among the biggest pieces in the entire American arsenal, fired on the position with almost equally disappointing results. Fort Driant's steel-reinforced concrete, built specifically to withstand exactly this kind of bombardment from an earlier generation of siege artillery, simply absorbed the punishment and kept functioning, its 5 150mm gun batteries still capable of raking American positions along the Moselle whenever they chose to fire. What followed was one of the costliest, most frustrating engagements Patton's army fought anywhere in the entire war. On October 3rd, American troops of the 5th Infantry Division, nicknamed the Red Diamond Division, renewed the assault on Fort Driant, using Bangalore torpedoes and satchel charges to try to blast their way into the fort's defenses directly, rather than relying on distant bombardment that had already proven ineffective. One company managed to fight its way onto the southwestern section of the fort's roof and held that precarious position for 2 full days, under constant counterattack from German troops emerging out of tunnels and bunkers the Americans hadn't even known existed until they were already being fired on from them at close range. A captain leading the assault from the deepest point his men had managed to reach sent back a message that captured the entire operation in a handful of stark words. The situation, he reported, was critical. Within another day, 2 of the assaulting companies had been reduced to under 100 men each, ground down by German artillery fire directed from neighboring forts that could see and shell the American positions on Driant almost at will, while German troops still holding sections of the fort's own interior continued launching sorties against the exhausted Americans clinging to what little ground they'd gained. Patton, characteristically, refused to accept that the attack might simply fail. He was quoted telling his own staff that he would not allow an operation by his army to end in defeat, whatever it took to prevent that outcome. A stance that, for several more days, translated into more American soldiers being fed into a battle that was, by every practical measure, already lost, with no realistic path to actually clearing the fort's underground tunnel network using the forces and tactics available. General Omar Bradley, Patton's own immediate superior, grew visibly frustrated with his subordinates' refusal to simply bypass a single stubborn fort rather than continue bleeding his army against it, especially given how little Driant actually blocked in terms of Third Army's broader path toward Germany. Finally, on October 9th, Patton convened a meeting with his senior commanders at Metz, and after hearing that his own troops were exhausted and that the Corps simply lacked the manpower to clear Driant's tunnel network the way it would actually need to be cleared, position by position, tunnel by tunnel, at enormous cost, he agreed to call off the assault. The withdrawal, carried out on the night of October 12th into the 13th, was itself marred by a mysterious explosion in one of the fort's tunnels that killed 4 American soldiers and nearly gassed 23 more. Whether by accident or deliberate German action was never fully established, one more unresolved grim footnote to an already costly failure. When the final tally came in, the fight for Fort Driant alone had cost the Third Army roughly 64 men killed, more than 500 wounded, and nearly 200 missing or captured. A defeat so complete and so uncharacteristic for a general known throughout the Army for aggressive success that historians studying Patton's career have since identified it as the only battle he ever definitively lost. The setback forced a genuine change in approach. Meanwhile, north of the main assault on Fort Driant, American troops of the 90th Infantry Division fought their own grinding, largely overlooked battle for control of Mézières-les-Metz, an industrial suburb whose factory buildings and cellars gave German defenders ideal cover for close-range, house-to-house fighting. It took the better part of a month of costly, incremental combat before the town was finally secured, gains measured in single buildings and city blocks, rather than the sweeping advances Third Army's soldiers had grown used to making across open French countryside just weeks earlier. Rather than continuing to hurl infantry directly at Metz's strongest individual fortifications, Third Army shifted its strategy in early November toward bypassing the toughest positions entirely and focusing instead on encircling the city itself, cutting off its garrison's ability to escape or be resupplied regardless of how long any individual fort chose to hold out in isolation. It worked far better than the direct assaults had. Within days of the renewed offensive, American forces had successfully surrounded Metz, sealing off its last escape routes and leaving the German garrison inside with no realistic hope of relief or reinforcement. Troops of the 95th Infantry Division, soon nicknamed the Iron Men of Metz for the brutal, patient fighting that followed, pushed into the city itself alongside other Third Army units, fighting street by street through a garrison that, per Hitler's own standing order, had no authorization to surrender, no matter how hopeless its position became. The last organized German resistance inside Metz proper finally collapsed and surrendered by November 22, 1944, nearly 2 months after the campaign had first begun in earnest. Patton entered the fallen city on November 25th in a procession that, by every account, felt considerably more like the arrival of a conquering general from antiquity than a 20th-century army commander accepting a hard-won surrender. Roughly 4,000 German prisoners had already been rounded up from the city and its weaker outlying positions. Patton addressed his assembled troops with characteristic grandiosity, telling them their deeds at Metz would fill the pages of history for 1,000 years to come. It was, in at least one specific sense, a genuinely earned boast. Patton had just become the first commander in roughly 1,500 years to capture the city of Metz through direct military assault rather than starvation or negotiated surrender, the previous occasion having been the forces of Attila the Hun, who took the city in the year 451, a piece of historical trivia that made for genuinely striking material for Patton's own considerable talent for self-promotion. The battle wasn't actually finished, though the city itself had fallen. 4 of Metz's strongest remaining forts, Driant among them, along with Jeanne d'Arc, Plappeville, and Saint-Quentin, continued to hold out under a newly arrived German commander, Lieutenant General Heinrich Kittel, a fortress warfare specialist Hitler had personally dispatched from the Eastern Front specifically to stiffen the city's defense once it became clear how desperate the situation around Metz had become. Kittel took direct command in mid-November after his predecessor suffered a stroke, and concentrated what remained of the garrison's strength and supplies specifically around those 4 positions, determined to fulfill Hitler's standing order to fight to the last man regardless of what had already happened to the city surrounding them. On the very evening he assumed command, a final supply train reached Metz from the east, bringing several more weeks of rations and nearly 50 additional artillery pieces, the last meaningful resupply the isolated garrison would ever receive. It bought only a few more weeks. By December 8, 1944, Forts Saint-Quentin, Plappeville, and, finally, Driant itself all surrendered, the garrison at Driant revealing, among its prisoners, elements of an SS Panzer Grenadier Division and an officer training regiment that helped explain just how disproportionately fierce the resistance at that single fort had been all along, far beyond what a standard garrison unit would typically have offered. The last holdout, Fort Jeanne d'Arc, finally surrendered on December 13, 1944, formally bringing an 11-week battle to its end. Military historians, and even some of Patton's own German opponents, were sharply critical of how the whole campaign had actually been fought, and their criticism didn't wait decades to surface. Some of it came from men who had lived through the fighting on both sides of the line. The British historian and strategist Basil Littlehart later noted, with some understatement, that Third Army had begun crossing the Moselle as early as September 5th, and was barely any further forward 2 weeks later, or, for that matter, 2 months later, a pointed observation about how little ground had actually changed hands relative to the casualties absorbed getting there. General Johannes Blaskowitz, the German commander initially facing Patton before being replaced for what Hitler considered excessive caution, offered his own blunt assessment after the war. A direct attack on Metz's fortifications had been unnecessary in the first place, he argued. and a swing north toward Luxembourg and Bitburg instead would likely have produced a far faster collapse of the German defensive line, potentially threatening the entire German First Army's flank, rather than grinding directly into its most heavily prepared defensive position. Both critiques point at the same uncomfortable truth. The general most associated in American memory with speed and aggressive maneuver had spent nearly 3 months of the war's final winter grinding through a fortress system that a different approach might have avoided or unraveled far more quickly and at a fraction of the cost. The cost went beyond the immediate casualties at Driant and the other forts. The 10 weeks Third Army spent reducing Metz meant German forces defending the city, though ultimately defeated, had bought themselves valuable time that let other German units withdraw in reasonably good order toward the Siegfried Line defenses along the German border, preserving experienced troops, artillery, and equipment that would resurface weeks later in a very different fight, catching American forces by surprise in the Ardennes forest during what became known as the Battle of the Bulge. It's a sobering thought that some of the very units that had bled Patton's army, white in the forts around Metz, were within weeks redeployed into the force that would go on to inflict one of the war's last great shocks on the American High Command. Metz's fall cleared Lorraine for Third Army's eventual advance toward the Saar region and the Siegfried Line itself, opening roughly 40 to 60 miles of additional ground toward the German border. But the momentum Patton had built up racing across France that summer never fully returned once winter, mud, and 1,500 years of accumulated fortress engineering had finished with him. What had been intended as a quick crossing point on the road to Germany instead became the longest, costliest single delay of his entire wartime command. If you want to hear the story of the Battle of the Bulge, the German counteroffensive that caught Allied forces by surprise weeks after Metz finally fell, that's a story for another video. Let us know in the comments which forgotten battle we should cover next.